Welcome to Hauntales, where darkest stories come alive. I know many of you tune into these tales to drift off to sleep, so settle in, relax, and get comfortable. Whether you're lying in bed or curled up on the couch, let the whispers of these chilling encounters carry you away. Before we begin tonight's story, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more spine-tingling tales, and let me know in the comments where are you listening from, and what time is it. I love seeing how far our stories travel. For the best experience, use your headphones, close your eyes, and let every word sink deep into your mind. Now we begin our stories for tonight. The Cursed Tree of Eldergrove. Prologue. The Legend of Eldergrove. In the heart of Eldergrove Forest, hidden away from prying eyes, stood a gnarled, ancient tree unlike any other. Its bark was twisted and blackened, with roots that snaked deep into the earth like the grasping hands of the damned. Locals called it the Wishing Tree, a name that was whispered with both reverence and fear. The tree had been there for centuries, older than the town itself, and its sinister reputation was well known. According to legend, the Wishing Tree had the power to grant any desire, but at a terrible price. It demanded a soul for every wish fulfilled. The townspeople of Eldergrove spoke of the tree in hushed tones, warning their children never to venture too close. They knew the stories of those who had been lured by its dark promises, how their wishes, granted with eerie precision, had ultimately led to their undoing. The tree's roots fed not on water or soil, but on the souls of the desperate and the greedy, forever bound to its twisted bark. Chapter 1. The Discovery. It was the summer of 1987 when Nathaniel Nate Anderson, a restless teenager with dreams of escaping his small-town life, first heard about the Wishing Tree. He had just turned 17 and was tired of the constant grind of school, chores, and the suffocating predictability of Eldergrove. His parents, conservative and strict, had never allowed him the freedom he craved, and he often found himself wandering the outskirts of the forest, looking for a sense of adventure. One afternoon, Nate's best friend Eddie told him about the Wishing Tree. Eddie was the kind of guy who loved urban legends and had a knack for finding the eerie and the unusual. He had heard about the tree from his grandfather, who spoke of it as if it were an old, dangerous friend. "It's real, man," Eddie said, his eyes wide with excitement. "You just have to ask it. But you gotta be careful, people say it takes more than it gives." Nate was skeptical but intrigued. The idea of a tree that could grant wishes seemed ridiculous, but he couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to finally have control over his life. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest, Nate decided he would see the tree for himself. Chapter 2. The First Wish. Nate and Eddie ventured into the forest the next day, weaving through the dense underbrush until they reached a clearing. There, at the center, stood the Wishing Tree. It was even more imposing than Nate had imagined. Its bark was black and charred, with thick, twisted branches that seemed to stretch toward the sky like the claws of a beast. The air around the tree felt heavy, charged with an unsettling energy. Nate could almost hear faint whispers, as if the tree were alive, beckoning him closer. Eddie stood back, nervous but eager to see what would happen. Nate approached cautiously, feeling both drawn and repelled by the tree's presence. He placed his hand on the rough bark, feeling a strange warmth radiate from it. For a moment he hesitated, but then he thought of all the things he wanted: money, freedom, a way out of Eldergrove. "I wish for a new life," Nate whispered. "I wish for enough money to leave this town and never look back." The tree seemed to shudder, and the air around it grew still. Nate felt a sharp prick on his palm, as if the bark had come alive and pierced his skin. Blood dripped onto the roots, and the tree absorbed it hungrily. Nate recoiled, his hand stinging, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental had just occurred. The next morning, Nate's life began to change. His parents won a large sum in the lottery, enough to move to a big city, far from Eldergrove. They packed up within days, excited at the prospect of starting over. For Nate, it was a dream come true. But as the days passed, strange occurrences began to plague his dreams. Visions of the Wishing Tree, its roots entwined with shadowy figures, and whispers that grew louder each night. Chapter 3. The Price of Desire. Nate's new life started promisingly enough. His family moved to a bustling city, and he was enrolled in a prestigious school. For the first time, Nate felt like he had control over his destiny. But soon, things took a dark turn. He started seeing things, ghostly figures lurking at the edge of his vision, flickering out of existence whenever he turned to look. One night, as Nate lay in bed, he saw the outline of a woman standing at the foot of his bed, her eyes hollow and empty. She reached out to him, her voice a raspy whisper. "Return what you took." Nate jolted awake, drenched in sweat. He tried to brush it off as a nightmare, but the visions persisted. Each night, more figures appeared, souls trapped by the wishing tree, their faces twisted in anguish. The tree had taken more than just his blood. It had claimed the souls of the desperate, binding them to its roots. Eddie, too, was not immune. After his encounter with the tree, he began to suffer from bouts of depression and paranoia. He confided in Nate that he had seen things in his dreams, dark, terrifying things that seemed to pull at his very essence. Eddie grew more withdrawn, haunted by the decision to seek out the tree in the first place. As the visions intensified, Nate realized he had made a grave mistake. The wishing tree didn't just grant desires, it ensnared those foolish enough to ask, feeding off their souls and leaving them hollow. Chapter 4. The Return to Eldergrove. Determined to end the curse, Nate convinced Eddie to return to Eldergrove with him. They ventured back into the forest, retracing their steps until they reached the clearing. The wishing tree stood as ominously as ever, its branches twisted and dark against the setting sun. Nate approached the tree with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Take it back," he demanded, slamming his hand against the bark. "I take it all back." The tree's bark pulsed under his touch, and Nate felt a sharp pain shoot through his arm. Shadows began to swirl around them, and the whispers grew into a deafening roar. Nate and Eddie stumbled back as the ground beneath them shifted, revealing skeletal hands clawing their way to the surface. The souls trapped by the tree were rising, and they were angry. One of the spirits, an elderly man with hollow eyes, stepped forward. His voice was a hollow echo, filled with despair. "You cannot undo what has been done. The tree's hunger is eternal." Nate realized the full horror of the situation. The wishing tree's power was irreversible. The only way to end the suffering was to sever its source. Desperate, Nate grabbed a nearby axe left behind by a previous visitor. He swung at the tree with all his might, each strike reverberating through the air like a scream. The tree groaned, its bark splintering under the blows, but it fought back, its roots snaking around Nate's legs, pulling him closer. Eddie tried to help, but was thrown back by an unseen force. The tree's power was overwhelming, fueled by centuries of stolen souls. As Nate continued to hack away, the tree's roots tightened, and Nate could feel his strength waning. With one final, desperate swing, Nate severed a massive root, and the tree let out a guttural, otherworldly howl. The ground trembled, and the spirits began to dissipate, their forms fading into the ether. The tree's branches wilted, and its bark turned to ash, crumbling away until nothing remained but a dark, empty crater. Epilogue: the end of the curse. The wishing tree was no more, but the cost had been far greater than Nate could have ever imagined. As he and Eddie stumbled out of the forest, their bodies battered and their minds weary, they shared a grim understanding: some horrors, once awakened, can never be fully laid to rest. Eldergrove, a place once steeped in whispers of the unknown, had become something else entirely, a graveyard for forgotten dreams and the souls who had dared to dream them. Weeks passed, and though life returned to some semblance of normalcy, Nate found himself haunted by more than just memories. Every now and then, he could still feel the cold, skeletal grip of the tree's roots tightening around his ankles, hear the whispers of those lost souls echoing in the wind. Eldergrove Forest, now eerily silent, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for another fool to come along, unaware that the tree was gone, but its influence remained. The town itself began to change, subtly at first. The locals, once bound by the superstition and the fear of the wishing tree, seemed to forget its existence. New families moved in, the old tales faded, and the dark history of Eldergrove slipped into myth. It was as if the forest, in its malevolent wisdom, had allowed its memory to be erased, knowing that one day another curse would take root in the hearts of the desperate. Nate never spoke of that day to anyone, not even to Eddie, who himself became more distant as the weeks turned into months. The friendship that had once bonded them through shared adventures and foolish dreams slowly withered, as though the weight of their shared burden was too much to bear. They moved on with their lives, but the forest and what had happened there remained like a shadow at the edge of their thoughts. Years later, Nate returned to Eldergrove for his parents' funeral. The town had changed, but the forest remained. It loomed in the distance like a specter, unchanged and waiting. As he stood at the graveyard, laying flowers on the freshly turned soil, Nate glanced toward the distant line of trees, half expecting to see the gnarled shape of the wishing tree standing tall once more. But it was gone. And yet, as he stood there, the wind began to pick up, rustling through the leaves, bringing with it a faint whisper, a voice so familiar it made Nate's skin crawl. "Return what you took." His heart skipped a beat. He turned sharply, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the breeze and the quiet, patient forest. His pulse quickened, and the old fear stirred in his chest. He knew the wishing tree was gone, destroyed by his own hands, but the curse it lingered. Nate left Eldergrove that day, vowing never to return again, but the curse followed him, in ways subtle yet insidious. He found himself avoiding forests, fearing shadows that danced at the corners of his vision. In moments of quiet, when the world was still, he could hear the trees whisper, growing louder with each passing year. Time passed, but Nate was never truly free. In the back of his mind, he knew that the wishing tree's roots had run deeper than anyone could have imagined. It had not just claimed souls, it had planted something in him, a seed, a hunger. An ever-present reminder that some wishes cannot be undone, and some bargains can never be escaped. He dreamed often of the souls he had seen rising from the earth, of their hollow eyes, their outstretched hands. They had not been freed by the tree's destruction, they had merely been released, and they were waiting for him. On the last night of his life, Nate woke in a cold sweat. The whispers were louder than ever, the weight of the curse pressing down on him. His heart pounded as he stumbled to the window, looking out into the night. There, standing just beyond the reach of the streetlights, he saw it, the shape of a tree, its twisted branches silhouetted against the moonlight, as if it had followed him across the years. And he knew with a sickening certainty that the wishing tree had never truly died. It had only gone to sleep, waiting for its next victim. As the darkness closed in around him, Nate whispered into the stillness, "I'm sorry." But the wishing tree does not forgive. It only waits. Oh, and one way or another, it always collects its due. The true story of haunting of Greymoor Manor in Scotland, UK. Long before Greymoor Manor became the death trap it's known as today, it was a beacon of wealth and prestige. Built in the early 1700s by Lord Edward Blackwell, a man renowned for his sharp business acumen and an even sharper appetite for power, the manor was a marvel of its time. But behind the towering stone walls and glittering social events lay a secret as dark as the shadows that haunted the family. Edward Blackwell, ambitious and arrogant, was not content with mere wealth. His hunger for power led him to the occult, seeking to extend his life and gain mastery over the forces of the unknown. Deep beneath Greymoor Manor, in a hidden chamber accessed only through a concealed passageway in the study, he conducted rituals that few dared to speak of. He communed with ancient entities, spirits of an older world, beings that promised him eternal life and limitless power. But these entities, hungry for dominion in the mortal realm, had a price, one that Edward, in his greed, was willing to pay. The spirits demanded a life, a soul, that would belong to them forever. Blackwell, cold and unfeeling, chose his young wife, Lady Amelia, as the sacrifice. She had been nothing more than a tool in his ambitions, and he believed that by offering her soul, the spirits would grant him immortality. But Edward's arrogance led to his downfall. During the ritual, something went wrong. As Lady Amelia was offered to the ancient forces, her spirit did not fade into the underworld as Blackwell had intended. Instead, she lingered caught between life and death, trapped in the manor where she had lived and loved, and with her, the dark entities also took root in the house. They twisted her soul, filling her with rage, sorrow, and an insatiable desire for revenge. Lady Amelia's death marked the beginning of Greymoor's curse. Blackwell, thinking himself victorious, began to notice strange happenings within the manor. Shadows seemed to move on their own. Whispers echoed in the empty halls. And at night, he swore he saw his wife's figure standing at the foot of his bed, her eyes hollow, her mouth twisted in silent accusation. Within a year, Edward Blackwell descended into madness. The entities he had summoned were not content with just one soul. They began to consume him, slowly breaking his mind. His own servants reported seeing strange lights in the manor, hearing unnatural sounds at night, and many fled in fear. One stormy night, Blackwell vanished without a trace. Some say he was taken by the very spirits he had summoned, while others believe his wife's vengeful ghost dragged him into the darkness. But the manor never forgot. Amelia's soul, still bound to Greymore, became a harbinger of the curse. Every generation that followed, anyone who entered the manor, anyone who lived within its walls, became part of her tragic haunting. The spirits trapped their craved souls, and Amelia, twisted by her suffering, became their unwilling guide. Chapter 1. Michael and Emily. The manor's latest victims. It was centuries later, in 1923, when historian Michael Grayson and his assistant Emily Carter arrived at Greymore Manor, unknowingly walking into the heart of its curse. They believed they were on the brink of an incredible discovery, unaware that the house had been waiting for them, as it had waited for countless others. The moment they stepped through the front doors, the manor seemed to awaken. Whispers that had been silent for decades began to stir. Michael and Emily had come seeking answers about Lord Edward Blackwell's disappearance, but instead they found themselves trapped in a web of spirits, each one hungry for release or revenge. As they explored the darkened halls, Michael, ever the rational scholar, initially dismissed the strange occurrences, a shadow here, a whisper there. But Emily was more sensitive. She felt at first the cold, suffocating presence that followed them room to room. She heard the cries for help, the faint echoes of the manor's former inhabitants, trapped forever in the decaying walls. It wasn't long before they encountered her. Lady Amelia's ghost appeared first in fleeting glimpses, a figure standing at the top of the stairs, the flash of white in the corner of their eyes. But each sighting brought them closer to the truth. As they descended deeper into the manor's secrets, Michael began to realize what they had stumbled upon. Greymore wasn't just haunted, it was a prison for the souls of the damned. In the hidden chamber beneath the house, where Edward had performed his dark rituals, they found the remnants of the occult symbols scorched into the stone floor, and there, scrawled in what looked like blood, were the final words of Edward Blackwell: "She will never let me go." The spirits grew more aggressive. The figure of Lady Amelia no longer remained at a distance. She stood in the doorway when they tried to leave, her eyes black, her voice a broken whisper begging for release. The shadows on the walls began to writhe, clawing at them, pulling them deeper into the house's grip. And then, one night, the door to the outside world sealed shut forever. Michael's journal entries became more frantic as the days passed. Emily, once the voice of reason, became consumed by the whispers. They spoke of freedom, of a way out, but always led her further into despair. Michael tried to keep them grounded, but the manor had other plans. Eventually, it was just Michael left, scrawling his last thoughts in the journal before succumbing to the darkness. The manor had claimed them, as it had claimed so many before. Chapter 2. A New Visitor. The curse awakens again. Years passed, and the legend of Greymore Manor grew. Few dared approach it, and those who did rarely ventured close. That is, until 2024, when a paranormal investigator named Daniel Reeves arrived in the small village of Gairloch. Daniel had made a career of debunking ghost stories, but Greymore fascinated him. The disappearances, the whispers, the journal that had been found decades ago, it all seemed too fantastic to be true. He was convinced that there was a rational explanation, and he intended to find it. Armed with modern technology, Daniel set out to investigate the manor. As he approached the gates, he felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if the place was somehow familiar. The villagers had warned him not to go, speaking of the curse and the voices that lingered in the air around the house. But Daniel dismissed their superstitions until he heard it himself. Standing at the gates, camera in hand, he heard a faint voice, just above a whisper. It was soft, pleading. "Help us, please, help us." Daniel froze. The voice was too real, too human. He followed it, his heart pounding in his chest as the voice grew louder. It was a woman, her words choked with fear and desperation. "Don't leave us here." The voice sounded so alive, so present. It was as if she were standing right next to him. Daniel's mind raced. Could this be one of the victims, still alive, somehow trapped? He pushed open the gates and entered the overgrown courtyard. The manor stood silent, imposing, its windows dark and empty. Inside, he began his investigation, setting up cameras and motion sensors, but the voice didn't stop. As he moved through the rooms, it followed him, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind. And then, it wasn't alone. "Michael." "Emily," the voice whispered, as if calling for someone. Daniel's blood ran cold. He had read about Michael Grayson and Emily Carter, the historians who had vanished in the past over a century ago. But how could their voices still be here, echoing through the halls as if they were still alive? Determined to uncover the truth, Daniel delved deeper into the manor's history, finding journals, photographs, and cryptic notes left behind by those who had come before him. Each one told the same story of whispers, shadows, and a figure with glowing eyes. As the days passed, Daniel began to feel the weight of the manor pressing down on him. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, the air grew colder, and the whispers became clearer. It was no longer just Michael and Emily he heard. Other voices, dozens, maybe hundreds, began to call out to him. The souls of those who had been trapped there, victims of Lady Amelia and the dark forces she had unleashed centuries ago. Daniel realized that the haunting wasn't just about ghosts. The manor itself was a living entity, feeding on the souls of those who entered, trapping them in an endless cycle of torment. And now, it wanted him too. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, Daniel followed the voices to the hidden chamber beneath the house. There, in the dim light of his flashlight, he saw them faint, ghostly figures, barely visible but unmistakably human. Michael, Emily, and so many others. Their faces were etched with sorrow and pain, but they looked at him with hope, as if he might be the one to free them. But before he could act, the figure with glowing eyes appeared. Lady Amelia, twisted and vengeful, stepped from the shadows, her gaze fixed on Daniel. The manor had claimed another victim. Epilogue: The Legacy of Greymore. Daniel Reeves was never seen again. His cameras and equipment were found scattered in the courtyard, untouched by time, but no trace of him remained. His disappearance, like those before him. Epilogue continued, a final hope. Daniel Reeves' disappearance made headlines, fueling the legend of Greymore Manor further. Investigators found nothing but eerie footage from his cameras, each clip cutting out at the most crucial moments. In one recording, just before the screen went black, there was a chilling image, a shadowy figure with glowing eyes, hovering behind Daniel. Months passed, and soon the story of Greymore fell back into whispers. The manor's curse had claimed yet another soul, leaving only more unanswered questions. But the story wasn't over. In 2025, a young woman named Lily Reeves arrived in Gareloch. She was Daniel's sister, and unlike him, she believed in the supernatural. She had been plagued by disturbing dreams ever since Daniel's disappearance, dreams of a woman in white, crying for help, dreams of her brother calling out from the darkness. Lily knew she couldn't just leave it alone. She had to find him. Armed with her brother's research and her own psychic abilities, Lily set her sights on Greymore Manor. The village elders warned her, just as they had warned Daniel, but she was resolute. What she lacked in scientific skepticism, she made up for with intuition and determination. As Lily stood before the gates of the manor, a wave of dread washed over her, but she felt something more: a connection. She could sense Daniel, his energy faint but still present. Taking a deep breath, she stepped through the overgrown courtyard and entered the cursed house. Inside, the whispers began immediately, but they were clearer this time, almost as if they had been waiting for her. Unlike Daniel, Lily could communicate with the spirits, and they guided her toward the hidden chamber beneath the house, where Edward Blackwell had once performed his dark rituals. The air was thick with a malevolent force, but Lily pressed on, determined to reach her brother. The spirits of Michael, Emily, and the other victims appeared before her, their faces filled with pain but also hope. They begged her to end the curse, to release them from their torment. Then she saw Daniel, his ghostly figure, pale and weary, standing among the others. "Lily," he whispered, "I'm sorry." I couldn't stop. Her tears welled up in Lily's eyes, but she refused to let fear consume her. She was so close. Suddenly the temperature dropped, and the shadows twisted into an unnatural shape. Lady Amelia appeared, her glowing eyes fixed on Lily. She was more terrifying than Lily had imagined, her face twisted by centuries of rage and suffering. The curse had corrupted her soul beyond recognition. But Lily didn't back down. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You were a victim too. You can still find peace." For a moment, Lady Amelia hesitated. Her ghostly form flickered as if the words had stirred something deep within her, a memory of the woman she had once been. But then the dark forces that controlled her reasserted their grip. The glowing eyes flared, and she lunged at Lily. In that instant, Lily raised a small object, a silver locket she had found among Daniel's belongings. It was engraved with the initials AB. Lily had discovered that it once belonged to Lady Amelia, a token of love given to her before her life had been destroyed. The sight of the locket stopped Amelia in her tracks. Her glowing eyes dimmed, and her ghostly form began to waver. Lily Daniel's voice was weak but urgent. "The locket. It's the key. Break the connection." With trembling hands, Lily opened the locket and found inside a small, faded photograph of a young Amelia, smiling, an image of her before she had been consumed by darkness. It was a reminder of the woman she once was, the life she could have had. Lily held the locket up toward Amelia's ghost. "You don't have to be their prisoner anymore," Lily whispered. "You can be free." Amelia's form flickered again, her expression softening. For the first time in centuries, the rage in her eyes seemed to fade. She reached out, her translucent hand hovering over the locket. The spirits that had bound her screamed in protest, their dark energy swirling violently around the room. But Amelia's will was stronger. With a final, agonized cry, Lady Amelia broke free from the dark forces that had controlled her. Her spirit, once twisted and malevolent, began to dissolve into light. The other trapped souls, including Michael, Emily, and Daniel, followed, their faces filled with relief as they were finally released from the manor's grip. As the last of the spirits faded, the oppressive atmosphere of Greymore Manor lifted. The house, once a prison for the souls of the damned, became eerily quiet. The curse had been broken. Lily stood alone in the chamber, tears streaming down her face. Her brother was gone, but she knew he had found peace. Clutching the locket, she whispered, "Goodbye, Daniel." She left Greymore Manor behind, the dark legacy of the Blackwells finally laid to rest. The villagers would speak of her bravery for years to come, but Lily didn't care about the stories. She had done what she came to do. As she walked away from the manor for the last time, she felt a sense of closure. Greymore would never claim another victim. And for the first time in centuries, the whispers were silent. Years passed since Daniel Reeves vanished within Greymore Manor, and his disappearance became just another entry in the manor's long list of lost souls. The village of Gairloch, once silent and cautious about the curse, now actively avoided the manor. No one dared speak its name. Greymore stood, watching, waiting as it always had. But the house would not remain quiet forever. In 2032, a new generation of paranormal investigators, lured by fame and technology, were determined to uncover the truth behind the legend of Greymore. Among them was Evelyn Harper, a renowned paranormal investigator with a reputation for solving the most baffling supernatural mysteries. Unlike others, Evelyn was motivated by more than curiosity. She was Daniel Reeves' niece, and she had grown up hearing the whispers of her uncle's disappearance. Now, armed with the latest tech and an unshakable resolve, she returned to the place that had swallowed him whole. Evelyn entered Greymore Manor one cold October evening, her breath visible in the biting air. As she crossed the threshold, the heavy door creaked behind her, sealing her fate. But Evelyn wasn't afraid. She had spent her entire life preparing for this. The manor was as it always had been, its halls dark, its air thick with something heavy and unseen. But Evelyn had studied the journals, the evidence left behind by Michael, Emily, and even her uncle Daniel. She knew where to go. She followed the same path that had led them all to the hidden chamber beneath the house. With every step, she felt the manor's attention on her, as if the house itself was watching, waiting. As she descended into the basement, the whispers began. At first they were faint, like wind brushing past her ears, but they grew louder, and soon Evelyn could hear them clearly, voices calling out, desperate and pleading. "Help us, please, free us." Evelyn steeled herself. She had expected this, but then the voices changed. Her heart skipped as she heard a voice she knew all too well. "Evelyn, Evelyn." It was Daniel. Her pulse quickened, but she did not falter. The manor was trying to break her. She knew that. It was playing with her, as it had with so many before. But she wouldn't let it win. Finally, she reached the hidden chamber. The remnants of Edward Blackwell's occult ritual were still visible, faded symbols scorched into the stone floor. the air thick with the smell of decay and something far older, but it was the figures in the room that caught Evelyn's breath. There were there Michael, Emily, Daniel, and the others, ghostly, translucent, their faces twisted with sorrow and pain, yet there was a flicker of hope in their eyes as they saw her. Daniel stepped forward, his face drawn with the weight of centuries. "Evelyn, I didn't want you to come," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "But you're here now, and you can end this." Evelyn's throat tightened. "How?" Before he could answer, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. The shadows in the corners of the chamber deepened, and from within them, she emerged. Lady Amelia, her form no longer the twisted, vengeful figure she had once been, but something far more terrifying. Her eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, her body surrounded by a swirling darkness that seemed to bend the very air around her. "You cannot take them," Lady Amelia hissed, her voice a thousand whispers layered upon one another. "They are mine, as you will be." Evelyn felt a wave of dread wash over her, but she stood firm. She had come too far to fail now. "Why?" Evelyn asked, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Why do you hold them here? You were a victim once too." Lady Amelia's face contorted with rage. "A victim? I was betrayed by the man I loved, sacrificed for his greed." Her voice grew louder, reverberating off the walls. "They all deserve to suffer as I have suffered." Evelyn took a step forward. "You were wronged, but trapping these souls won't give you peace. They don't deserve this." Lady Amelia's form flickered, as if her resolve wavered for a moment, but then the darkness around her grew stronger, and her eyes burned with anger. "You will suffer as they have," she screamed, and the shadows lunged toward Evelyn. In that moment, something snapped within Evelyn. She wasn't just here for answers, she was here to end the curse once and for all. In her research, she had uncovered a secret about the manor, something no one before her had known. The ritual Edward Blackwell had performed all those years ago had left a weak point in the house's defenses, one that could be exploited. With quick, precise movements, Evelyn retrieved a small vial from her pocket, a mixture of salt, iron, and holy water she had crafted based on ancient texts. She threw it to the ground at her feet, and as it shattered, a shock wave of light erupted through the chamber, forcing the shadows back. Lady Amelia shrieked, her form beginning to unravel, the darkness around her dissipating. "No," she screamed. "You cannot end this. I am bound to this place." Evelyn stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "You don't have to be. You can let go. Free yourself, and free them." For a long, tense moment, Lady Amelia's form flickered between rage and sorrow, her features softening as the light pushed back the darkness. Then, with a final mournful wail, she dissolved into nothingness, the ancient curse that had bound her to Greymore Manor finally broken. The room was silent. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and for the first time in centuries, Greymore Manor felt at peace. Ace, Michael, Emily, Daniel, and the others stood before Evelyn, their faces no longer twisted with torment but with relief. Daniel stepped forward, his eyes filled with pride and sorrow. "You did it," he whispered. "You broke the curse." Evelyn felt tears welling in her eyes. "I came for you," she said softly. Daniel smiled, a sad, wistful smile. "And now I can go. We all can." With that, the spirits began to fade, their forms becoming lighter and more translucent until they disappeared completely, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the chamber. For the first time in centuries, Greymore Manor was empty. Conclusion: the end of the curse. Evelyn walked out of the manor into the crisp morning air, the first rays of sunlight breaking over the horizon. As she stood at the gates, looking back at the house, she felt a profound sense of closure. The curse was lifted, and the spirits of Greymore were finally at rest. But the legend of Greymore Manor would never be forgotten. It would remain a place of mystery, a reminder of the darkness that once consumed it. And though the house was no longer cursed, the story of Greymore would live on, a tale of betrayal, revenge, and redemption. As Evelyn turned to leave, a final whisper carried on the wind. "Thank you." The Haunting of the Anders Family. Prologue. The house on Elmwood Street. In the quiet suburb of Ravenwood, Nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac on Elmwood Street stood a charming two-story house with white shutters and a red brick exterior. For years, it was the quintessential family home, filled with the laughter of children and the warm glow of holiday lights. But everything changed when the Anders family moved in. It was the summer of 2021 when Robert and Margaret Anders, along with their two children, Sophie and Jacob, purchased the house. They were drawn to its classic charm, spacious backyard, and the friendly neighbors who welcomed them warmly. For a few months, life seemed perfect, but beneath the surface, something dark and vengeful had been waiting, biding its time. By the end of the year, the Anders family would become the subject of whispers and warnings, as their home turned into a living nightmare that would haunt the town for years to come. Chapter 1. The First Signs. It started subtly, just small, easily dismissible things that any busy family would overlook. Lights flickered randomly, strange creaks echoed through the house at night, and objects seemed to move on their own. Sophie, the youngest, often complained about the man with no eyes she saw at the foot of her bed, but her parents chalked it up to vivid dreams and overactive imagination. But soon the disturbances became harder to ignore. Doors slammed shut with force, even when there was no wind. Whispering voices filled the house, disembodied and angry, muttering in a language no one could understand. The air grew heavy, and the once cozy home felt oppressive, as if it was alive and watching. One evening, as Margaret was preparing dinner, she glanced out the window and saw a figure standing in the backyard. It was a tall, shadowy silhouette, unmoving and featureless. She blinked, and it was gone. She brushed it off as a trick of the light, but a nagging fear began to gnaw at her. Chapter 2. The Possessions Begin. The first real incident happened during a family dinner. As they sat around the table, talking about their day, Jacob suddenly went quiet. His eyes rolled back, and he began to mutter in a deep, guttural voice that wasn't his own. The words were unintelligible, dark and harsh, spoken with a cadence that chilled the room. Robert tried to snap Jacob out of it, shaking him gently, but Jacob's body convulsed violently, and he let out a scream so piercing that it shattered the glass in Margaret's hand. He collapsed onto the floor, unconscious, as his family watched in horror. After that night, things escalated quickly. Sophie became increasingly withdrawn, her once bright and cheerful demeanor replaced by a vacant stare. She began drawing disturbing images of twisted figures with clawed hands and empty eyes. She spoke less and less, often whispering to herself in corners, as if she was having conversations with invisible entities. Margaret's health began to deteriorate. She lost weight rapidly, developed deep circles under her eyes, and her hair started falling out in clumps. She often woke up with scratches and bruises that she couldn't explain. Robert, the most skeptical of them all, tried to keep the family together. But he too began experiencing vivid nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night to find himself standing at the foot of his bed, staring blankly at his sleeping wife. Chapter 3. The Neighbor's Suspicion. The neighbors on Elmwood Street were the first to notice the drastic change in the Anders family. The once friendly and sociable couple now rarely left the house. The curtains were always drawn, and strange noises could be heard late at night: screams, thuds, and furniture dragging across the floor. Mrs. Hernandez, who lived next door, recalled seeing Margaret standing in the yard one morning, staring up at the sky with an expression of sheer terror. When she called out to her, Margaret simply turned and walked away, her movements stiff and unnatural, as if she were being controlled by invisible strings. The neighborhood children dared each other to run up to the Anders house, but none of them got too close. The once welcoming home now seemed to pulsate with a dark energy. The air around it felt heavy, suffocating, and filled with a sense of dread. The most disturbing incident occurred when Mrs. Thompson, a devout Christian, claimed to have seen a dark figure standing in the Anders' upstairs window late one night. She described it as impossibly tall, with glowing red eyes staring directly at her bedroom window. She swore she heard it whisper her name before disappearing into the darkness. Terrified, she called the police, but when they arrived, they found nothing. Chapter 4. The church gets involved. As word spread about the strange happenings at the Anders house, the local church decided to intervene. Father Thomas, a seasoned priest known for his work in spiritual warfare, agreed to visit the home. He had dealt with alleged hauntings before, but nothing could prepare him for what he encountered inside the Anders residence. The moment he stepped through the front door, Father Thomas felt an overwhelming sense of evil. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of decay, and the temperature plummeted as if the house itself was rejecting his presence. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if alive. Father Thomas attempted to bless the house, sprinkling holy water in every room while reciting prayers. But as he moved deeper into the home, the whispers grew louder, filling his ears with blasphemous taunts. In the dining room, the crucifix he carried began to burn his hand, forcing him to drop it. The holy water sizzled on the floor, evaporating instantly. When he reached Sophie's room, he found her sitting in the corner, her eyes black as coal, staring blankly at the wall. She began to speak in a voice that wasn't hers, a deep, mocking tone that recounted sins and secrets only he could know. Father Thomas tried to command the demon to leave, but Sophie's body contorted violently, her bones twisting in unnatural angles. Before he could react, she lunged at him, snarling like a wild animal. The priest was thrown across the room, his body hitting the wall with a sickening thud. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing his crucifix, and backed out of the room, the door slamming shut behind him with a deafening bang. Chapter 5. The horrors escalate. After Father Thomas's failed exorcism, the possessions worsened. The entire Anders family was now under the demon's control, their bodies merely vessels for the vengeful spirits that haunted the house. Neighbors reported hearing agonized screams at all hours of the night, accompanied by the sound of breaking glass and crashing furniture. Margaret would be seen walking the streets in the early hours of the morning, her head twitching violently from side to side, speaking in a language that no one recognized. On one occasion, she was found kneeling in the middle of the road, her skin pale and eyes bloodshot, carving symbols into her arms with a broken piece of glass. Robert, who had once been the family's anchor, was now a shadow of his former self. He rarely spoke and seemed to have lost all sense of time and reality. He spent hours standing in the basement, staring at the walls, whispering to unseen entities. His body was covered in scratches, and he had developed a habit of clawing at his skin, as if trying to peel something off. The children were no better. Jacob's possession had left him in a near catatonic state. His eyes, once bright and full of life, were now dull and empty. He would often be found sitting in the dark, rocking back and forth, humming nursery rhymes in a slow, eerie monotone. Sophie's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She would burst into fits of violent rage, screaming and throwing things, her small frame possessed by an unnatural strength. Chapter 6. The Final Descent. As the possessions continued, the Anders family became prisoners in their own home. The demons had taken full control, using their bodies as puppets to enact their twisted desires. Neighbors stopped visiting, afraid of what they might find, and the once vibrant house on Elmwood Street became a dark, foreboding monument to the supernatural horrors that lurked within. One evening, Mrs. Hernandez heard a commotion coming from the Anders house. She looked out her window to see Robert standing on the roof, teetering on the edge. His arms were outstretched, and he was shouting incoherently into the night, his voice echoing with a distorted, otherworldly quality. Margaret and the children stood below, watching him with blank expressions, their heads tilted unnaturally to the side. Before anyone could react, Robert let out a bone-chilling scream and jumped. He hit the ground with a sickening crunch. But to Mrs. Hernandez's horror, he stood up moments later, his body twisted and broken, yet somehow still moving. He turned and walked back into the house, his bones cracking with each step. Chapter 7. The Last Attempt at Salvation. Desperate, the neighbors banded together, reaching out to anyone who could help. The local church, now fully aware of the severity of the possession, called in a team of renowned demonologists and exorcists. They arrived at the Anders home armed with holy water, crosses, and every protection spell they knew. As they entered, the house reacted violently. The walls seemed to bleed, oozing a thick, black substance that stained everything it touched. The air was filled with the sound of growls, screams, and mocking laughter, as if the house itself was taunting them. The exorcists split up, each taking a room, chanting prayers and burning incense in an attempt to cleanse the home. But the demons fought back, lashing out with terrifying force. One exorcist was thrown down the stairs, another pinned to the wall by an unseen force. The house shook violently, as if trying to tear itself apart. In the living room, Margaret's body convulsed as the demons inside her resisted. her bones twisted and snapped, her limbs bending in unnatural directions. She let out a blood-curdling scream as her face contorted, shifting between her own and a demonic visage with hollow eyes and a mouth full of jagged teeth. Sophie and Jacob joined in, their voices merging into a cacophony of rage and despair. The exorcists tried to hold their ground, but the power of the entities was too great. The house shook one last time, and with a deafening roar, the lights went out. Chapter 8. Aftermath. When the sun rose the next morning, the Anders family was gone. The house was empty, save for the scattered debris and the lingering stench of sulfur. The exorcists, battered and bruised, had managed to escape, but they carried with them the scars of what they had witnessed. No one knew where the Anders family had gone. Some believed they had been consumed entirely by the demons, their souls trapped in the house forever. Others whispered that they still roamed the streets of Ravenwood, waiting to reclaim their home. The house on Elmwood Street was condemned and boarded up, deemed too dangerous for anyone to enter. But those who passed by at night swore they could still hear the faint sound of whispers and screams, carried on the wind, a chilling reminder of the dark forces that had taken hold of the Anders family. Epilogue. The house waits. To this day, the house remains abandoned, a silent witness to the horrors that unfolded within its walls. Despite efforts to sell or demolish it, no one has dared to enter since that fateful night. It stands as a warning, its windows dark and empty, as if watching, waiting for its next victims. And every so often, when the night is still and the moon is high, a flicker of light can be seen in the upstairs window, followed by the faint sound of a child's laughter, a chilling echo of the family that once lived there, now lost to the darkness forever. The Lost Town of Black Hollow. Prologue. The Legend of Black Hollow. Deep in the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, nestled between two towering mountain ranges and hidden by thick forests, lies a town that most have never heard of. Black Hollow. It isn't marked on any modern maps, and those who stumble upon it rarely find their way back. But Black Hollow wasn't always a ghost town. In the late 1800s, it was a thriving mining community built on the promise of gold and prosperity. At its peak, hundreds of families lived there, its streets filled with the sounds of bustling saloons, blacksmiths, and children playing in the streets. But in 1894, something happened. The town was abandoned overnight. No one knows exactly why, but the few accounts that remain speak of strange occurrences, shadows that didn't belong to anyone, whispers that drifted on the wind, and people disappearing without a trace. Within weeks, Black Hollow was a ghost town, left to rot and decay as the forests slowly reclaimed it. Over the decades, it faded from memory, becoming nothing more than a local legend. Yet for those brave or foolish enough to go searching for it, Black Hollow remains, and what they find is far more terrifying than any ghost story. Chapter 1. A Group of Friends, 2023. It was late August when a group of 4 friends, Rachel, Mike, Sarah, and Jason, decided to go on a hiking trip through the Pacific Northwest. They were experienced hikers, looking for an adventure off the beaten path. The air was crisp, the forest dense and silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves underfoot. As they walked, Jason, the group's unofficial leader, mentioned the old ghost town he had read about. Black Hollow. "There's this old mining town somewhere around here," he said, pulling out his phone to show them the article. "It's not on the map, but people have found it over the years. Apparently it's haunted." Sarah rolled her eyes. "You believe in that stuff?" Jason shrugged. "I don't, but the stories are creepy. People who've gone looking for it either never find it or disappear." That caught everyone's attention. Mike, always the skeptic, laughed it off. "So, we're supposed to get lost in the woods looking for some made-up town. Pass." But Rachel was intrigued. "What if we found it? It would be like finding a piece of history." After some back and forth, curiosity won out, and they decided to search for Black Hollow. As they veered off the main trail, the forest seemed to change. The air grew heavier, and the towering trees began to block out more and more of the light, casting long shadows across the forest floor. They hiked for hours, losing track of time as they followed what seemed to be an old, overgrown path. As dusk began to settle in, Rachel noticed something in the distance, a faint outline of structures barely visible through the trees. "Is that..." They quickened their pace, pushing through the thick underbrush until they emerged into a clearing. There it was, Black Hollow. The town stood eerily still, its wooden buildings sagging with age, roofs caved in, windows shattered. The streets were overgrown with weeds, but the buildings were unmistakable: an old saloon, a general store, a church, all abandoned and crumbling. The fading light of the setting sun cast long, twisted shadows over everything, making the town seem alive in a way that sent a shiver down Rachel's spine. "This is it," Jason whispered, as if speaking too loudly would disturb whatever lay dormant in the town. As they walked through the streets, the silence was oppressive. It felt wrong, like they weren't supposed to be there. Sarah, who had been the most dismissive of the ghost stories, was now visibly uncomfortable. "This place gives me the creeps. Let's just take a look and head back before it gets dark." But as they explored, strange things began to happen. Mike swore he saw movement in one of the windows, a shadow darting across, though no one else saw it. Rachel felt a chill at the back of her neck, as if someone was standing right behind her. But when she turned, no one was there. And then there were the whispers. At first they thought it was just the wind, but as they ventured deeper into the town, the whispers became clearer, almost like voices. "Did you hear that?" Rachel asked, her voice shaking. "Hear what?" Jason replied. "The whispering." Jason froze. "I thought that was just the wind." But it wasn't. The whispers grew louder, almost as if they were coming from the buildings around them, from the darkened windows and doorways. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, reaching for them. Panic began to set in. "We need to go," Sarah said, her voice trembling. But as they turned to leave, they realized something terrible. The path they had entered through was gone. The trees had shifted, closing in around the town, and the forest now seemed impenetrable. "We're trapped," Mike said, his voice hollow. The whispers grew louder still, echoing off the decaying walls, and then, as if in response to their fear, the shadows began to move. Chapter 2. The Couple, 1978. Decades before Rachel and her friends stumbled upon Black Hollow in the summer of 1978, a young couple, Tom and Lisa, found themselves lost in the same stretch of forest. They had been on a road trip, looking for a place to camp, when their car broke down miles from the nearest town. With no cell phones and no way to call for help, they decided to hike through the woods to find a nearby service road. As night fell, they wandered deeper into the forest, hopelessly lost. The tall trees blocked out the moonlight, and the thick canopy above made it impossible to see the stars. Just when they were about to give up and set up camp for the night, they saw a faint glow in the distance. "Maybe it's a town," Lisa said, her voice tinged with hope. Tom wasn't so sure, but they had no other option. They followed the light until they reached the edge of a clearing, and there, standing silent and still, was Black Hollow. The town seemed almost preserved, as if it had been waiting for them. The buildings were old but intact, and a faint light flickered from within one of the windows of the saloon. They cautiously approached, calling out for help, but there was no answer. "I don't like this," Lisa whispered. "Something feels off." But Tom was determined to find help. They pushed open the door to the saloon, its hinges creaking loudly in the silent night. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the floor creaked under their weight. "Hello," Tom called out again, his voice echoing in the empty space. Then, from the back of the room came a reply, faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. A voice. "Help us." Lisa gasped. "Did you hear that?" Tom nodded, his heart pounding. It sounded like someone. They followed the sound to the back of the saloon, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for a few overturned chairs and broken bottles. And yet, the voice continued, growing louder, more desperate. "Help us." Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. Lisa shivered, her breath visible in the frigid air. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice shaking. "Something's wrong." But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a force that made the entire building shudder. They were trapped. The windows rattled, the floorboards groaned, and the whispers began low, menacing, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Tom tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. "We're not alone," he said, his voice barely a whisper. And then they saw a shadow, slowly creeping across the floor, moving toward them. But it wasn't just one shadow. There were many, all shifting and writhing, as if the very darkness of the town had come to life. Lisa screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence that had fallen over the town. The shadows closed in around them, and the last thing they heard before everything went dark was the same voice, whispering in their ears, "You'll never leave." Tom and Lisa were never seen again. Their abandoned car was found by the side of the road, but no trace of them was ever discovered. Black Hollow had claimed 2 more souls. Chapter 3. The Curse of Black Hollow. The Curse of Black Hollow dates back to the town's founding in the late 1800s. It began with a mining accident, at least. That's what the official records say. But the truth is far more sinister. In 1894, a group of miners working deep underground unearthed something they were never meant to find: an ancient burial site, long forgotten and buried beneath the earth for centuries. The miners, driven by greed and the promise of gold, disturbed the graves, unearthing something dark and evil. That night, the town was engulfed in chaos. People began to disappear, and those who remained were plagued by strange visions and haunting whispers. Shadows moved on their own, and the air became thick with an unnatural chill. The townsfolk, desperate and terrified, turned to the local preacher for help, but it was too late. The curse had already taken hold. By the end of the week, Black Hollow was empty. Those who hadn't disappeared fled, leaving everything behind. The town became a ghost town, haunted by the spirits of the miners who had unleashed the curse and the souls of those who had fallen victim to it. Over the years, people would occasionally stumble upon Black Hollow, drawn in by the mystery and the promise of adventure, but those who entered rarely left. The curse of the town claimed them, trapping their souls within its decaying buildings, forever lost to the shadows. Epilogue: The New Visitor. It's been nearly 150 years since Black Hollow was abandoned, but the town still stands, hidden deep in the forest, waiting for its next victim. In the summer of 2024, a new visitor arrived, a journalist named Emma, investigating the strange disappearances and the legend of Black Hollow. She had read about the town and the stories of those who had gone missing, but she didn't believe in curses or ghosts. She was determined to find out the truth. As she wandered through the empty streets of Black Hollow, she felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if she had been there before. The buildings, though decayed and crumbling, seemed alive, watching her with unseen eyes. And then she heard the sound of voices, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the empty streets. "Help us." Emma froze. The voice was coming from the saloon. Slowly she approached, pushing open the door. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay, but there, standing in the middle of the room, were 2 figures, a man and a woman, their faces pale and eyes hollow. "Please," the woman said, her voice barely a whisper, "help us." Emma took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. The figures faded into shadows, disappearing before her eyes. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a force that shook the building. And then the whispers began. Emma was never seen again. Black Hollow had claimed another soul, and the town waits, silent and patient, for the next visitor to cross its cursed threshold. The Whispering Walls, The Haunting of Ashcroft Asylum. Prologue: The Dark History of Ashcroft Asylum. In the quiet, forgotten town of Haverbrook, surrounded by endless fields and thick forests, stood Ashcroft Asylum. Built in the early 1920s, it was once a state-of-the-art institution designed to house and rehabilitate the mentally ill. But the promises of care and compassion quickly turned to neglect and horror. Ashcroft's reputation became notorious for its cruel treatments and questionable experiments. Whispers of strange occurrences, abusive staff, and unexplainable deaths spread through the community. By the late 1950s, the asylum was abandoned after a mysterious fire engulfed the East Wing, killing several patients and a nurse. The incident was shrouded in secrecy, with officials claiming it was an accident, but locals knew better. They spoke of a curse of dark, malevolent forces that had always resided in the asylum, feeding off the despair and suffering of its inhabitants. Now, decades later, Ashcroft Asylum stands in ruins, overgrown with ivy, its windows broken and its halls silent. But those brave enough to enter report hearing strange voices, seeing shadowy figures in the corridors, and feeling an oppressive presence watching their every move. The town has long since closed off the asylum grounds, warning anyone who dared approach that the spirits of Ashcroft's past were still there, waiting for the next visitor. Chapter 1. The Group. It was late autumn when a group of 6 urban explorers decided to visit the infamous Ashcroft Asylum. Eric, the leader of the group, was a seasoned adventurer with a particular interest in abandoned buildings. He had heard about the asylum from a local legend video and was fascinated by its history. His friends Mia, James, Sarah, Tom, and Lucy were intrigued as well, though not all were as eager to face the horrors that supposedly lurked inside. They arrived at the crumbling gates of Ashcroft at dusk. The sky was a mix of orange and pink, fading into deep purple as the sun set behind the asylum's towering silhouette. The building loomed over them like a monster, its once grand facade now covered in vines and graffiti, its broken windows like dark, hollow eyes. "This place is huge," Mia whispered, staring up at the sprawling structure. "Yeah, and creepy as hell," James added, rubbing his arms as if the temperature had suddenly dropped. Eric grinned. "That's the point, isn't it? We're here to explore, maybe get a few scares. Let's head inside before it gets too dark." The group passed through the rusted gates and made their way up the overgrown pathway toward the entrance. The front doors were long gone, replaced by a gaping hole that led into the dim, musty interior of the asylum. As they stepped inside, the cold, stale air hit them like a wall. The atmosphere was thick with neglect and decay, the smell of mildew and rot overpowering. Flashlights flickered on, casting long shadows against the cracked walls. The lobby of the asylum was eerily quiet, the only sound their footsteps echoing off the tiled floor. Old wheelchairs and gurneys lay abandoned in the corners, covered in dust. The remnants of the past were everywhere: scattered papers, broken furniture, medical charts yellowed with age. "Okay, let's split up," Eric said, pulling out a map he had found online. "The asylum is huge, so we should cover as much ground as we can. We'll meet back here in an hour." "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Lucy asked nervously. "I mean, splitting up in a haunted asylum sounds like the start of a horror movie." Eric chuckled. "Come on, it'll be fine. We've got walkie-talkies. If anything weird happens, we'll regroup. Let's explore." Reluctantly, the group divided into pairs: Eric with Mia, James with Lucy, and Sarah with Tom. They ventured into the dark corridors, flashlights barely cutting through the thick darkness. Chapter 2. Eric and Mia's Discovery. Eric and Mia headed toward the east wing, where the mysterious fire had occurred all those years ago. The walls were blackened with soot, and the air smelled faintly of burned wood, even after all this time. As they walked deeper into the wing, the temperature seemed to drop, and Mia shivered. "Do you feel that?" she asked, rubbing her arms. "Yeah," Eric replied, his voice quieter now. "It's colder here than the rest of the building." They came across a large, metal door, its surface warped from heat, the handle melted beyond recognition. This must have been the source of the fire. Eric pushed the door open, and it groaned on its rusted hinges. Inside was what had once been the hospital's operating room. Scorched medical equipment lay scattered around, and the walls were covered in charred remnants of old medical charts. Mia walked cautiously to the center of the room, her flashlight sweeping over the cracked tile floor. Then, she saw something that made her stop dead in her tracks. "Eric, look." Lit. On the floor, in the middle of the room, was a large, blackened symbol, a pentagram, burned into the tile. Surrounding it were strange markings, almost like letters or runes, though neither of them could make out what they meant. "What the hell?" Eric muttered, stepping closer. "This wasn't in the official records." "No kidding," Mia whispered, her heart racing. "What do you think this means?" "I don't know," Eric admitted, feeling a sudden unease creep over him, "but it definitely doesn't look good." As they stood there, the temperature seemed to plummet even further. Their breath came out in visible puffs of steam, and the air became oppressive, as though the very walls were pressing in on them. Then, from somewhere in the distance, they heard a low, guttural whisper, echoing down the hall. "Did you hear that?" Mia asked, her voice shaking. Eric nodded, his eyes wide. Yeah, I think we should get out of here. But as they turned to leave, the door to the operating room slammed shut with a deafening bang. Chapter 3. James and Lucy's Ordeal. Meanwhile, James and Lucy had ventured into the west wing where the patients' rooms were located. The long corridor stretched out before them, lined with doors that led to small, cell-like rooms. Each door had a tiny window, through which they could see the decaying remnants of old beds and furniture. "This place gives me the creeps," Lucy said, glancing nervously at the doors. "It feels like we're being watched." James, always the skeptic, shrugged. "It's just an old building, nothing to be scared of." But as they continued down the hall, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Every now and then, she thought she saw movement in the corner of her eye, shadows flitting across the walls, just out of sight. The further they went, the more oppressive the air became, thick with an unsettling energy. They stopped in front of one of the rooms. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, Lucy saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure, standing in the corner of the room, facing the wall. "James," she whispered, grabbing his arm. "There's someone in there." James frowned and shined his flashlight through the gap. The figure was still there, unmoving, its back to them. "There's no way," James muttered. "This place has been abandoned for years." But as they watched, the figure slowly turned, its head twisting at an unnatural angle until it was facing them. Its face was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted, malevolent grin. Then, without warning, it rushed toward the door. Lucy screamed and stumbled back, but when the door swung open, the room was empty. What was that?" Lucy gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. I don't know," James stammered, his face pale, "but we need to get out of here. Now." Chapter 4. Sarah and Tom's Terror. Sarah and Tom had made their way to the basement, where the asylum's morgue was located. The stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into the darkness, the smell of damp and decay growing stronger with each step. "I don't like this," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It feels wrong down here." Tom, trying to stay calm, nodded. "Let's just take a quick look and then head back." They reached the bottom of the stairs and found themselves in a narrow hallway lined with metal doors body-blown with metal storage units from when the asylum was still in operation. The walls were stained with water damage, and the air was thick with the smell of rot. As they walked down the hall, their footsteps echoing in the silence, they heard a faint sound like the creaking of one of the metal doors being slowly opened. Tom shined his flashlight down the corridor, but there was nothing there. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah," Tom replied, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "Let's keep moving." They reached the end of the hall and found the morgue's examination room. Inside, old, rusted tables stood in the center of the room, surrounded by decaying medical equipment. The walls were lined with shelves covered in dust and cobwebs. As they entered the room, the door behind them slammed shut, and the temperature plummeted. A thick fog seemed to seep in from the walls, and the room grew darker, despite their flashlights. Then they heard a voice, soft and chilling, whispering from the shadows. "Why are you here? Why are—" Sarah and Tom froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. "Did you hear that?" Tom whispered, his voice shaking. Before Sarah could answer, the lights on their flashlights flickered and went out, plunging them into complete darkness. The whispers grew louder, closer, until they felt as though they were surrounded by invisible figures, their breath cold on their skin. And then from the darkness came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching them. Chapter 5. The aftermath. Back in the lobby, an hour had passed since the group had split up, and no one had returned. Eric and Mia were trapped in the East Wing, James and Lucy were lost in the West Wing, and Sarah and Tom were fighting for their lives in the basement. One by one, their walkie-talkies crackled to life, but all they could hear was static, and then the faint, distant sound of screaming. The asylum had claimed them. Epilogue. The investigation. A month later, a team of investigators entered Ashcroft Asylum to search for the missing explorers. What they found were the remnants of their camp, abandoned flashlights, backpacks, and cameras, but no sign of the group. The footage they recovered from the cameras told a chilling story of doors slamming on their own, shadowy figures lurking in the corridors, and the eerie sound of whispers echoing through the halls. The final piece of footage showed Eric, standing in the operating room, staring into the camera with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. The investigators never found the bodies of the explorers, and Ashcroft Asylum remains abandoned, its dark secrets waiting for the next group of curious souls to venture inside. But those who do never return. Chapter 6. The Origins of the Haunting. The haunting of Ashcroft Asylum wasn't just the result of the tragic deaths or the fire that swept through its east wing. It was far more sinister, reaching back to the very foundation of the asylum. In 1918, the land where Ashcroft now stood was part of a large estate owned by the Blackwell family, a powerful and secretive family known in the town of Haverbrook for their wealth and influence. But they were also known for something far darker, rumors of occult practices, black magic, and blood sacrifices that had been whispered about for generations. In the early 1920s, the patriarch of the Blackwell family, Edgar Blackwell, suddenly fell ill. Doctors couldn't explain his rapid decline. He grew weaker by the day, his body wasting away, as if something unseen was draining the very life from him. Desperate for a cure, the family turned to their hidden knowledge of the occult, seeking to make a pact with darker forces in exchange for Edgar's life. On the night of the ritual, the family gathered in the basement of their estate, invoking ancient names and calling forth spirits long forgotten. But something went terribly wrong. The ritual backfired, unleashing a malevolent entity that had been lurking beneath the land for centuries, an ancient, powerful being that thrived on fear, madness, and suffering. The entity consumed the souls of the Blackwell family, twisting them into grotesque, shadowy figures that haunted the estate. Edgar Blackwell's body was found the next morning, his face frozen in a scream of terror, his eyes blackened as if they had been burned from the inside. The rest of the family had simply vanished, leaving behind only the remains of the ritual. The estate was quickly abandoned, left to rot as the years passed. It wasn't until 1924 that the state bought the land and decided to build Ashcroft Asylum. Construction workers reported strange occurrences during the building process, tools going missing, strange sounds echoing through the unfinished halls, and the feeling of being watched. But the project continued, and the asylum was completed in 1925. The asylum's first patients began to arrive soon after, and for the first few years, everything seemed normal. But as the number of patients grew, so did the darkness that had been unleashed by the Blackwell family. Patients and staff began to report sightings of shadowy figures in the hallways, doors slamming on their own, and whispers that seemed to come from the very walls. The entity had returned, feeding off the fear and torment of the patients, growing stronger with each passing year, and soon it began to claim its victims one by one. Chapter 7. The Forgotten Patient. One of the most infamous stories to come out of Ashcroft Asylum was that of patient 319, a man named Arthur Grayson. Arthur had been committed to the asylum in 1932 after suffering a complete mental breakdown. He had been a successful businessman, a loving husband, and a father of two, but something had changed. He began hearing voices, whispers that no one else could hear. They told him terrible things, filled his mind with dark thoughts, and eventually drove him to the edge of madness. By the time Arthur arrived at Ashcroft, he was a shell of his former self. He spoke only in cryptic riddles, muttering about the watchers in the walls and the darkness that never sleeps. The doctors were baffled by his condition and tried a variety of treatments, but nothing seemed to help. His condition worsened, and soon he became violent, attacking other patients and even the staff. In 1935, Arthur was moved to a special isolation ward in the East Wing, where the most dangerous and unstable patients were kept. There he spent the rest of his days locked in a small, windowless room, screaming at the shadows and carving strange symbols into the walls with his fingernails. When the fire broke out in 1952, Arthur was one of the patients who perished in the flames, or so they thought. When rescue teams searched the ruins of the East Wing, they found no trace of Arthur's body. His room, though badly damaged by the fire, was eerily intact. And on the walls of his cell, among the burned marks, were more of the strange symbols he had carved, symbols that matched the ones found in the Blackwell family's basement. To this day, Arthur's fate remains a mystery. Some say that he was taken by the entity, consumed by the darkness that had driven him mad. Others believe that his spirit still lingers in the asylum, a prisoner of the very forces that haunted him in life. Chapter 8. The couple's descent into madness. It was a cold, rainy night in October 1998 when a young couple, Josh and Emily, set out on what they thought would be a thrilling adventure. Josh had heard about Ashcroft Asylum from an urban legend forum online and convinced Emily to join him on an overnight exploration of the infamous building. Emily, though hesitant, eventually agreed, thinking it would be a fun and spooky way to celebrate Halloween. They arrived at the asylum just after midnight, the rain pouring down in sheets as they made their way through the overgrown path leading to the front entrance. The asylum loomed before them, its dark, hulking form barely visible through the storm. With flashlights in hand, they pushed open the heavy front doors and stepped inside. The air was thick with dampness and decay, and the sound of the rain pounding on the roof echoed through the empty halls. Josh, ever the thrill seeker, led the way deeper into the asylum, laughing nervously as they explored the abandoned rooms and hallways. But as they ventured further into the building, something began to change. The atmosphere grew heavier, the air colder. The sound of the rain faded, replaced by a deep, oppressive silence. Emily began to feel uneasy, as though they were being watched, but every time she turned around, there was nothing there. They reached the east wing, the site of the infamous fire, and that's when things took a darker turn. As they entered the charred remains of the wing, Emily heard a faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of their footsteps. She stopped, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Josh, did you hear that?" Josh turned to her, frowning. "Hear what?" "The whispering. It's like someone's talking." Josh chuckled nervously. "It's probably just the wind or something." But Emily wasn't convinced. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and soon it was joined by other sounds, footsteps, shuffling in the darkness, and the distant sound of a door creaking open. "We need to leave," Emily said, her voice shaking. "Something's not right." Josh was about to agree when the door behind them slammed shut with a force that shook the building. Their flashlights flickered and went out, plunging them into complete darkness. Panic set in as they fumbled with their flashlights, trying to get them to work, but the batteries were dead. They were trapped in the east wing, surrounded by the unseen forces that had haunted Ashcroft for decades. In the pitch black, Emily felt something brush against her arm, cold, like the touch of death itself. She screamed, and the whispering grew louder, more frantic, as if the very walls were alive with voices. They ran, blindly stumbling through the dark, trying to find their way out. But the asylum seemed to shift around them, the halls twisting and turning, leading them deeper into the heart of the building. No matter how fast they ran, they couldn't escape the voices, the whispers growing louder and louder until it was deafening. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence was suffocating. Emily and Josh stood in the middle of a long, narrow hallway, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They had no idea how they had gotten there or where they were. But the whispering had stopped, and for a moment they dared to hope that they were safe. That hope was short-lived. From the darkness ahead, a figure emerged. It was tall, with long, twisted limbs and a face that was barely human, its eyes hollow and black, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. It moved toward them with unnatural speed, its limbs contorting as it crawled along the walls. Josh and Emily turned to run, but the hallway behind them had disappeared, replaced by a solid wall of stone. There was no escape. The figure reached out with a clawed hand, and the last thing they heard was the sound of the whispering, soft, insidious, and full of malice. The couple was never seen again. In 2010, a well-known paranormal investigation team, led by renowned ghost hunter Mark Hastings, set out to investigate Ashcroft Asylum. They had heard the stories, seen the footage from previous explorers, and were determined to uncover the truth about the asylum's dark history. Armed with the latest technology, infrared cameras, EV recorders, motion sensors, and thermal imaging, they entered the asylum with a mix of excitement and trepidation. They had been to dozens of haunted locations before, but something about Ashcroft felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of dread that hung over the building like a dark cloud. As they set up their equipment, Mark felt a strange presence watching them. The other team members, Chris, Jenny, and Kyle, reported feeling the same unease, as though they weren't alone. Throughout the night, they captured several strange phenomena on their cameras, doors slamming on their own, objects moving without explanation, and shadowy figures darting through the hallways. But it wasn't until they reached the east wing that things took a terrifying turn. Mark had set up an F recorder in the remains of the isolation ward, hoping to capture evidence of the infamous patient 319. As he asked questions, hoping for a response, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the recorder picked up a voice low, guttural, and subtle, and filled with rage. "Get out!" Out. Mark's heart raced as he played the recording back. The voice was clear, unmistakable, but before he could react, the door to the isolation room slammed shut, trapping him inside. Panic set in as the walls seemed to close in on him. Mark pounded on the door, shouting for Chris, Jenny, and Kyle, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence that filled the isolation ward. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as the cold seemed to wrap itself around him like a shroud. The room darkened, his flashlight flickering weakly in the corner. On the other side of the door, Chris and Jenny struggled to open it. They could hear Mark's frantic banging but couldn't make out his words. Every attempt to break the door down or even pry it open with their tools seemed futile, as if some unseen force was holding it shut. Inside, Mark's panic began to morph into something more profound and unsettling, creeping sense of madness. The whispers returned, swirling around him, hissing through the air like venomous snakes. At first, he tried to ignore them, but they grew louder, more insistent. "You shouldn't have come," the voices whispered. "No one leaves." Mark backed up, his body trembling, as the air grew heavy with the stench of decay. His flashlight flickered out completely, plunging the room into darkness. In the blackness, his mind raced. Was it the entity the team had come to investigate? Was it the spirit of Arthur Grayson or something even older and darker? Suddenly, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He turned, but there was nothing there, just the suffocating darkness. Outside, Kyle, now desperate, tried one last time to ram the door, and to his surprise, it burst open. They found Mark crouched in the corner, muttering incoherently, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. He had scratches across his arms and chest, as though he had been attacked, but there was no one else in the room. The team hurried to get Mark out of the asylum, but as they made their way back through the winding hallways, strange things began happening. The temperature plummeted again, and the once solid structure of the asylum seemed to shift and change, the walls groaning like a living entity. Every corner they turned seemed to lead them deeper into the building, no matter which way they tried to go. The shadows in the hallways grew darker, thicker, until they began to take form, tall, gaunt figures with hollow eyes that followed the team silently. Jenny tried to rationalize it, blaming it on their fear and exhaustion, but the figures never disappeared. Then came the whispers again, louder than before, overlapping each other like a cacophony of voices all trying to speak at once. "They see you. They know you. You're one of them now." Chris pulled out his F recorder, trying to catch some evidence, but all that came through the device was static and a single voice repeating, "No escape. No escape." Mark, who had been silent since his encounter in the isolation ward, suddenly began to mutter again, "It's in me. It's inside me." Kyle glanced at him in alarm. Mark's eyes were glazed over, his pupils dilated, and a faint, unnatural grin tugged at the corners of his mouth. Something was terribly wrong. Chapter 9. The Night of Terror. They finally reached the front entrance of the asylum, but the heavy doors they had opened without any problem earlier were now locked tight. No matter how hard they pulled or pushed, the doors wouldn't budge. Chris, now on the verge of panic, began searching for another way out. It was then that they heard laughter, soft at first, then louder, echoing through the empty halls of the asylum. It was a deep, guttural sound filled with malice and mockery. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, and nowhere all at once. Then the shadows moved again, this time faster, more deliberately, closing in on the team. Shapes flickered in the dark, twisted, contorted figures that seemed less like ghosts and more like nightmares made real. Kyle, the most skeptical of the group, finally cracked. "We need to get out of here, no," he shouted, pulling at the doors with all his strength. But it was no use. Suddenly, one of the figures lunged at Jenny. She screamed as it passed through her, a cold, suffocating presence wrapping itself around her like a blanket of ice. Her body convulsed as if something was trying to pull her soul from her flesh. Chris grabbed her, pulling her away from the figure, and they all backed into the center of the room, their flashlights flickering wildly. Mark, now almost fully catatonic, began to laugh. It wants us. It needs us. It's hungry. And then the lights went out. When the lights came back on, they found themselves in a different room, entirely an old, decrepit operating room. Its walls covered in the same strange symbols that Arthur Grayson had carved into his cell. Rusted surgical tools were scattered across blood-stained tables, and the smell of rot and decay filled the air. In the corner of the room stood the figure, the same twisted, dark entity that had haunted Ashcroft for nearly a century. Its long limbs and hollow eyes seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and as it stepped forward, the room seemed to shrink around them. The figure extended a clawed hand toward Mark, who stepped forward as if in a trance, his face now twisted into that same grotesque grin the investigators had seen on the camera footage. "It's me at once." Before anyone could stop him, Mark collapsed, his body convulsing as the entity seemed to flow into him like a black cloud of smoke. His eyes rolled back, and a deep, guttural voice not his own spoke. "It is done. He is ours." The team could only watch in horror as Mark's body twisted and contorted, his bones snapping and shifting until he was no longer recognizable. He had become one of the shadows. Realizing they had no other choice, Chris, Jenny, and Kyle ran. They didn't know where they were going. Every hallway, every door seemed to lead them in circles, but the only thing they could do was run. Behind them, the shadowy figure that had once been Mark followed, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. The whispers grew louder, the walls seemed to close in on them, and the oppressive darkness swallowed everything. Finally, they found a broken window, its jagged glass offering their only way out. Without hesitation, Kyle smashed it open and helped Jenny climb through, cutting her hands in the process. Chris followed, but just as Kyle was about to jump, something cold grabbed his ankle. He looked down to see Mark, or what was left of him, gripping his leg with an inhuman strength, pulling him back toward the asylum. With a cry of terror, Chris and Jenny grabbed Kyle's arms and pulled with all their might. With one final, desperate effort, they yanked him free, and the three of them tumbled out into the cold night air. They didn't stop running until they reached the road. Months later, Chris and Jenny returned to the town of Haverbrook, hoping to find closure. Kyle had been deeply affected by the experience, refusing to speak about what happened that night, while Mark had never been found. The town had long since given up trying to solve the mystery of Ashcroft Asylum. It was just another story, another chapter in the dark history of the building that loomed on the outskirts like a decaying monument to madness. But Chris and Jenny knew the truth. They had seen the darkness that lived within those walls, felt its cold grip on their souls, and though they had escaped, they knew it was only a matter of time before the asylum claimed its next victims. Because the entity that haunted Ashcroft wasn't finished, not by a long shot. And even now it waits, watching, biding its time, waiting for the next group of curious souls to step through its doors. No one ever truly leaves Ashcroft Asylum. Not alive, anyway. The Last Voyage of the Lyric Star. Prologue, The Disappearance. In the summer of 2023, a luxurious cruise ship, the Lyric Star, set sail from Miami on its maiden voyage. Destined for a week-long tour through the Caribbean's most beautiful islands, the ship was a marvel of modern design, boasting everything from five-star dining to lavish suites and world-class entertainment. But what was meant to be a dream vacation for its 2,000 passengers and crew soon turned into an unthinkable nightmare. On the third night, the ship disappeared from radar without a trace. No distress signals were sent, no emergency broadcasts made. It was as if the Lyric Star had simply vanished into thin air. Days later, a search team discovered the ship adrift near the Bermuda Triangle. Its lights were still on, the buffets still stocked with fresh food, and passengers' belongings were scattered as if everyone had simply walked away, but there wasn't a single soul on board. The mystery of the Lyric Star became an enduring legend, a chilling reminder of the perils of the sea. But there was more to the story, something darker, hidden in the shadows of the ship's abandoned halls, waiting to be discovered. Chapter 1. The Invitation. Emma Caldwell was an investigative journalist with a reputation for chasing stories that others wouldn't dare touch. When she received an anonymous tip about a special invitation to experience the Lyric Star firsthand, she was intrigued. The ship, now docked and deserted, was being prepped for a relaunch, an attempt by the cruise line to dispel the haunting rumors and restore its reputation. Alongside her cameraman, Ben, Emma boarded the Lyric Star with a small group of thrill seekers and paranormal investigators invited to document the ship's first voyage since the incident. The cruise line promised a controlled environment with no dangers, but Emma had her doubts. As she stepped onto the polished deck, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The cruise began with an eerie sense of déjà vu. The ship was lavish, immaculate, but oddly lifeless. The small group was greeted with gourmet dinners, music playing softly in the background, and yet the atmosphere felt forced, almost like a performance. Emma couldn't help but feel that the ship was watching them, its empty halls echoing with faint, unidentifiable sounds. That first night, she and Ben set up their cameras to capture the ship's supposed paranormal activity. As they reviewed the footage, they noticed something odd, faint. Shadowy figures seemed to move just out of the camera's range, always in the periphery, as if the ship itself was playing tricks on them. Later, as Emma lay in bed, she heard faint whispers. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the voices grew louder, more distinct. She got up, grabbed her recorder, and followed the sound. The whispers seemed to lead her deeper into the ship, past the grand ballroom and toward the lower decks areas that were off limits. She tried to ignore the uneasy feeling growing inside her, but the voices were relentless. By the third day, the atmosphere on the ship had grown tense. Some of the group reported seeing shadowy figures on the lower decks, while others heard music playing from the ballroom late at night, even though no one had been there. Ben, normally a skeptic, started experiencing disturbing visions. A little girl in a blue dress standing at the end of a hallway, her eyes hollow and sad. Each time he tried to approach her, she vanished. Emma's investigation led her to an old crew member's journal hidden in one of the staff rooms. It belonged to a sailor named Marcus, who had worked on the ship during its original voyage. His entries grew increasingly paranoid, detailing strange occurrences, a passenger manifest that never matched the real count, shadowy figures appearing at night, and the crew being haunted by the sound of distant laughter. His final entry simply read, "They're not leaving. They're still here." Emma's heart pounded as she read the journal, realizing Marcus wasn't just talking about the passengers, but something far worse, something ancient and malevolent that had claimed the ship long before its maiden voyage. That evening, the group gathered by the ship's empty pool for a paranormal session, hoping to capture any evidence of the supernatural. Emma set up her equipment, trying to keep her mind off the journal's disturbing revelations. As they sat in silence, a cold breeze swept over the deck, and the lights flickered. Without warning, the pool lights turned on, illuminating the water below. The once clear water was now murky, churning as if something was moving beneath the surface. The group watched in horror as ghostly hands began to emerge, reaching upward. They were pale, emaciated, and desperate. Emma and Ben backed away, but one of the investigators, a man named Peter, was frozen in place, staring at the hands. He leaned forward, as if drawn by an invisible force, and before anyone could react, the hands grabbed at him, pulling him into the water. The group screamed as Peter vanished beneath the surface, his muffled cries echoing through the night. When the water finally settled, there was no sign of Peter, only his camera floating on the surface, still recording. They pulled it out, their hands trembling, and played back the footage. The screen showed the hands emerging from the water, but just before Peter was pulled under, the video distorted, showing a brief glimpse of something dark, something ancient, lurking beneath. Emma and Ben retreated to their cabin, shaken by the night's events. Ben was convinced they needed to leave immediately, but Emma was determined to find out what was haunting the ship. As she pieced together the clues from the journal and footage, a chilling pattern emerged. The Lyric Star was not just a ship, it was a vessel of torment, cursed long before its luxurious makeover. Emma uncovered the story of the ship's original purpose. It had been a transport vessel during World War II, shuttling soldiers and prisoners across treacherous waters. But something went horribly wrong during one of its final voyages, a massacre at sea, covered up by those in power. The souls of the dead were said to be bound to the ship, doomed to repeat their final moments for eternity. As Emma dug deeper, she found references to an ancient ritual performed by the ship's original captain in an attempt to harness dark powers to protect the vessel during the war. Instead, it had bound the spirits of the dead to the ship, turning it into a floating purgatory. The more Emma read, the more she realized that the Lyric Star was not adrift by accident. It was seeking new victims, new souls to feed its insatiable hunger. Emma's discovery only fueled her determination, but it also made her a target. That night, she and Ben were awakened by the sound of heavy footsteps outside their cabin door. They opened the door cautiously, but the hallway was empty. As they turned back, the door slammed shut on its own, and the temperature in the room plummeted. The walls began to pulse with a low, rhythmic thumping, like the heartbeat of some monstrous creature. The lights flickered violently, and the faint sound of old-time music filled the air. The melody warped and distorted. Suddenly, the room began to fill with water, rising quickly. Emma and Ben frantically tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The water was icy cold, and they could feel something moving beneath its surface, brushing against their legs. As the water reached their chests, Emma saw them ghostly faces staring up from the depths, their eyes empty, mouths open in silent screams. Just as Emma was about to be pulled under, the water receded as quickly as it had appeared. They were left gasping on the soaked floor, shivering from the cold and the terror. Ben was convinced that the ship was toying with them, testing their resolve. Desperate to get a message out, Emma and Ben headed to the communications room, hoping to send a distress signal. But when they reached it, the equipment was in shambles, wires ripped out and screens shattered. Yet the radio crackled to life on its own, broadcasting a haunting message. "We are still here, trapped. The ship won't let us go." The voice was Peter's, but it was distorted, twisted by some unseen force. Emma grabbed the microphone and tried to respond, but all that came back was a chorus of whispers, dozens of voices layered over each other, begging, pleading, warning. Emma realized these were the voices of the lost passengers still trapped on the ship, their souls bound by the curse. Ben turned pale, staring at the ship's navigation screen. The map showed their position right in the heart of the Bermuda Triangle, the place where countless ships and planes had vanished without a trace. The ship wasn't just haunted, it was cursed, trapped in a perpetual loop, forever drawn back to the source of its torment. As the ship's condition deteriorated, so did the mental state of those still on board. The paranormal investigators, once eager to document the supernatural, were now desperate to escape. One by one, they succumbed to the ship's pull, disappearing into the lower decks, never to be seen again. Emma and Ben knew they were running out of time. In a last-ditch effort, they made their way to the engine room, hoping to disable the ship and signal for help. But the room was dark, filled with shadows that seemed to move on their own. As they approached the control panel, the shadows coalesced into familiar faces, those of the missing passengers, now twisted and grotesque, their eyes full of malice. The ship was fighting back, determined to keep its secrets buried. Emma and Ben fought against the darkness, but it was too strong. In a final act of defiance, Emma smashed the control panel, causing the ship to shudder violently. The lights flickered, the walls groaned, and the shadows screamed in agony. The last thing Emma saw before everything went dark was the face of the little girl in the blue dress, standing in the doorway. She smiled, her eyes empty, and whispered, "We're never leaving." Weeks later, the Lyric Star was found adrift once more, back where it had started, near the Bermuda Triangle. The ship was empty again, its hull silent, but this time the manifest had changed. Among the names of the old passengers were two new entries, Emma Caldwell and Ben Harper. The cruise line, eager to bury the incident, quietly decommissioned the Lyric Star, but those who dared to venture near the ship at night claimed they could still hear the faint sound of music playing, accompanied by the whispers of the lost, forever trapped in the dark, endless corridors of the last voyage of the Lyric Star. Echoes of the Abyss. Months passed after the Lyric Star's final discovery, and the world quickly moved on, as it often does with unsolved mysteries. The cruise line hushed any further investigation, and the ship was docked permanently in a secluded harbor. It was left to rust and decay, far from prying eyes. But for those who knew of its cursed past, the Lyric Star became more than a legend, it was a warning. Emma and Ben's disappearance joined the growing list of victims claimed by the ship. Their families, like the others, were left with nothing but questions and grief, clinging to the hope that someday answers might emerge. But for the crew that worked in the shadows, dismantling the ship piece by piece, the truth was something they couldn't ignore. Strange reports began to surface from the workers tasked with decommissioning the Lyric Star. They claimed to hear voices in the empty corridors calling their names. Tools would vanish, only to reappear in different locations. The ship, though gutted and stripped of its lavish interiors, seemed to have a life of its own, unwilling to die. One night, a particularly brave or perhaps foolish worker ventured into the lower decks, determined to prove the rumors false. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a smirk, he descended into the ship's belly, taunting the stories of ghosts and curses. Hours passed without a sign of him. His co-workers grew nervous and sent a search party, but they never found him. His tools lay abandoned, his flashlight flickering at the edge of the pool, the water undisturbed. After that, the crew refused to enter the ship again. The project was abandoned, and the Lyric Star was left to rot. But those who lived nearby claimed the ship still moved, its silhouette shifting subtly at night, as though the spirits within were restless. Some even said they saw figures standing on the deck, staring out to sea, always waiting. Years later, urban explorers, lured by the ship's dark legend, began sneaking aboard. Many came back with tales of strange occurrences, a cold hand gripping their shoulder in the engine room, soft music drifting through the halls, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Others never returned at all. But it was the final recorded exploration that sealed the ship's fate. A group of thrill seekers determined to document the paranormal live-streamed their journey through the rusting husk of the Lyric Star. At first, it was the usual abandoned cabins, creaking metal, the eerie stillness of a forgotten place. But as they reached the ballroom, the signal began to flicker. For a brief moment, the camera caught something, a shadow moving across the room, followed by a faint, familiar whisper, "We're never leaving." The feed cut out abruptly. The group was never seen again. The Lyric Star now sits abandoned, its once gleaming exterior corroded and faded by time. But the ship remains vigilant, a silent sentinel in the harbor, still haunted by the souls trapped within its steel frame. On quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can hear them, the whispers of the lost, echoing across the water, bound forever to the last voyage of the Lyric Star. And for those who dare to come near, the ship still waits hungry for more. The Curse of Winterbrook. I came to Winterbrook for peace, for isolation, for a chance to escape the suffocating noise of the world. I didn't come looking for adventure. I didn't come looking for anything, really, other than quiet. The house on the edge of the mountain town seemed like the perfect retreat, nestled among trees with views that stretched forever. Winterbrook had an eerie charm, its rustic wooden buildings and winding streets offering a quaint aesthetic. However, as I drove through the narrow lanes, the welcoming facades felt more like a mask hiding secrets. The locals seemed strange, insular, and distant, but I didn't care. I was used to being the outsider, and the last thing I wanted was to be drawn into whatever small-town drama haunted their lives. Little did I know that they were haunted in ways far worse than I could have imagined. The previous owner of my house had left it in disrepair, but I saw potential in its crumbling walls and creaking floorboards. As I unpacked my things, the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me, wrapping me in an embrace that felt simultaneously welcoming and oppressive. The first night was uneventful, save for the strange sounds that echoed through the empty halls. The house had an unsettling quietness, broken only by the wind whispering through the trees outside. As I lay in bed, I thought I heard soft footsteps above me, but I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks. After all, old houses creaked and groaned. That was their nature. The next morning I set out to explore the town, eager to get a sense of the community. The main street was lined with small shops and a diner that looked as if it hadn't changed since the 1950s. As I walked in, the bell above the door tinkled, announcing my presence. The few patrons turned to look, their eyes filled with curiosity, but the warmth of their smiles was fleeting. They quickly returned to their meals, exchanging glances with one another, whispering in hushed tones. "Newcomer," I heard one woman say, her voice laced with a hint of warning. The diner's owner, a grizzled man named Frank, approached me with a forced smile. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, pouring me a cup of coffee that smelled rich and strong. "No, just moved into the old Harrow place," I replied casually, trying to gauge his reaction. His smile faltered, and I could see the color drain from his face. "You should be careful there. People say the Harrow place is cursed," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Cursed? What do you mean?" I pressed, intrigued. But Frank shook his head, waving a dismissive hand. "Just old tales. Nothing to worry about." He turned away, leaving me with a sense of unease that lingered like the bitter taste of coffee in my mouth. Returning home, I felt a chill settle in my bones. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The house loomed larger than life, its windows like dark eyes glaring down at me. I hesitated before stepping inside, the air thick with anticipation. That night, as I settled into bed, heard it again, the soft, deliberate footsteps above me. This time I couldn't ignore it. Grabbing a flashlight, I ascended the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. Each creak of the floor echoed like a drum, amplifying my fear. The upper floor was dark, shadows dancing along the walls as I scanned the area. The hallway was empty, but I felt an unmistakable presence. As I stepped into the first room, I noticed the walls were adorned with strange symbols. They appeared to be scratched into the wood, deep grooves that seemed to pulse with an energy of their own. I ran my fingers over the marks, feeling an electric tingle shoot through me. Then I heard it, a whisper, barely audible, brushing against my ear like a soft caress. I spun around, but the room was empty. My breath quickened, and I backed away, the weight of the house pressing down on me. I fled to my room, locking the door behind me, but the chill remained, wrapping around me like a shroud. The next day, I decided to confront the townsfolk. If there was something I needed to know about the house, I would dig deeper. I made my way back to the diner, determined to speak to Frank again. This time I noticed a group of older men gathered at a table in the corner, their heads bowed together, whispering intently. As I approached, they fell silent, eyes darting to me before returning to their hushed conversation. "You should leave that house alone," Miss one of them, a tall man with a weathered face, finally spoke. "You don't want to get involved in things that don't concern you." "What do you mean?" I asked, frustration bubbling inside me. "Is it the symbols? What do they mean?" The man sighed, glancing around as if ensuring no one else was listening. "You're treading on sacred ground. The Harrow family made a deal with the mountain long ago, and it hasn't been right since." I pressed for more details, but he remained evasive. "You'll see," he said cryptically before turning away. That evening I returned home, determined to uncover the history of the house. I dug through the boxes left behind by Elijah Harrow, hoping to find something, anything that would explain the strange occurrences. His journals revealed fragments of a life spent in fear, speaking of a dark presence in the woods and the rituals that the townsfolk participated in to appease it. The deeper I read, the more I realized the connection between the house, the town, and the woman in white. She was mentioned frequently, a ghostly figure who would walk the streets, watching, waiting for her next victim. Days turned into weeks, each night filled with whispers and footsteps that grew more desperate. The townsfolk avoided me, their glances filled with pity and fear. I felt increasingly isolated, the walls of the house closing in. I stopped sleeping, haunted by dreams of the woman in white, her hollow eyes following me as I tried to escape. One night, I could no longer bear it. I decided to confront my fear head-on. Armed with my flashlight and a determination fueled by desperation, I ventured into the forest. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above, casting the world into shadows that seemed alive. As I walked deeper into the woods, the atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with tension. The wind whispered secrets, and I felt as if the trees themselves were watching me. I stumbled upon a clearing where the symbols from the house were carved into the earth, glowing faintly in the moonlight. I could feel the energy pulsing around me, a powerful force that seemed to beckon me closer. Suddenly, a cold wind blew through the clearing, and I felt a presence, a shadowy figure emerging from the trees. It was her, the woman in white. She stood before me, her veil obscuring her face, but her eyes piercing through the darkness, searching for something within me. "Why do you linger here?" she asked, her voice echoing through the clearing like a mournful song. "You should leave while you can." "Why? What do you want from me?" I cried out, my voice trembling. She stepped closer, and the air grew colder. "I am bound to this place, just as you are now. A curse will not let you go. You are marked." Panic surged through me as I backed away, desperate to escape. I turned and ran, the forest closing in around me, branches clawing at my skin. I stumbled back to the house, my heart racing, adrenaline fueling my flight. The woman's voice echoed in my mind, haunting my every thought. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it tight, but the whispers grew louder, filling the room with their cacophony. I could feel the house shifting around me, the walls closing in, suffocating me with their secrets. I knew I had to confront the truth. I had to face the curse that had claimed Elijah and so many others before him. The next morning I set out to find Agnes, hoping she could provide answers, something to help me break the cycle. When I arrived at Agnes's home, I found her sitting on the porch, her eyes scanning the horizon as if she were waiting for something or someone. As I approached, she looked up, her expression a mixture of sorrow and understanding. "You've seen her, haven't you?" she asked, her voice steady. I nodded, unable to find my voice. "She's the one who watches over the cursed, a reminder of what happens when the pact is broken," Agnes continued. "The townsfolk believe that keeping the old ways will protect them, but they only serve to bind you to this place." "Is there a way to break the curse?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Agnes sighed deeply, her gaze drifting to the mountains in the distance. "You must confront the spirit of the mountain itself, uncover the truth of the pact made long ago. Only then can you hope to free yourself from her grasp." The days turned into a blur as I prepared for my confrontation with the spirit of the mountain. I studied Elijah's journals, piecing together the fragmented history of Winterbrook and the dark legacy of the Harrell family. As the next full moon approached, I could feel the tension building in the air, a palpable sense of dread that wrapped around me like a cloak. On the night of the full moon, I made my way back to the clearing. The moon hung high above, casting an ethereal glow over the symbols etched into the earth. I stood in the center, heart pounding as I called out to the spirit, hoping it would respond. As if in answer, a cold wind whipped through the clearing, and shadows danced around me. I felt the energy surge, a force pulling me toward the symbols. The air crackled with anticipation as I stood firm, determined to face whatever lay ahead. "Show yourself," I shouted, my voice echoing in the silence. The wind howled, and the shadows began to coalesce into a figure of massive form that loomed above me, dark and foreboding. The spirit of the mountain revealed itself, its eyes glowing like embers. "You dare disturb the balance," it boomed, voice echoing like thunder. "I seek the truth," I replied, standing my ground. "What happened to the Harrows? What is the curse that binds us all?" The spirit's form shifted, swirling like smoke, and I could feel its anger boiling beneath the surface. "The Harrows made a pact, a trade for prosperity in exchange for a soul to feed the mountain. They failed to deliver, and now you are caught in their web of deceit." In that moment, I understood the true nature of the curse. The woman in white was not merely a spirit, she was the soul promised to the mountain, bound to it by the betrayal of the Harrows. I could feel her sorrow and rage intertwined with the spirit's fury, a tragic tale of love and loss woven into the very fabric of Winterbrook. "I refuse to be a part of this," I shouted, voice unwavering. "I will not allow myself to be consumed by their sins." The spirit roared in anger, and the ground trembled beneath me. "You have no choice. You are marked by the past." But I felt a surge of strength rising within me, a fierce determination igniting my soul. "I will break this curse. I will find a way to free the woman and the town from this cycle." With those words, I reached deep into my heart, summoning the memories of love and loss I had experienced in my life. I envisioned the bonds that connect us all, our struggles, our triumphs, our shared humanity. The symbols around me glowed brighter, pulsing with energy as I poured my essence into the clearing. The spirit hesitated, confusion flickering across its dark form. "What is this?" it questioned, uncertainty creeping into its voice. "Hope," I declared, holding firm. "Hope for a new beginning, a chance to heal the wounds of the past." As the words escaped my lips, the clearing erupted in blinding light. The spirit howled in agony, and the woman in white emerged from the shadows, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. I reached out, extending my hand toward her, a bond of connection forged between us. In that moment, I felt the weight of centuries lift as the pact began to unravel. The whispers in the wind shifted to a gentle breeze, carrying the echoes of lost souls, healing their wounds one by one. The woman in white stepped forward, her veil lifting to reveal her tear-streaked face. "You have freed me," she whispered, her voice now a soft caress rather than a mournful wail. "I didn't free you, we freed each other," I replied, tears streaming down my face as I felt a warmth envelop me. As dawn broke over Winterbrook, the cursed legacy of the Harrows began to fade into the past. The townsfolk awoke, feeling the change in the air. As I returned to my home, I could sense the weight of the house lifting, the walls no longer suffocating but breathing with life. The woman in white became a legend whispered among the townsfolk, a reminder of the power of connection, hope, and healing. Winterbrook transformed, slowly shedding its dark past, allowing light to seep in. And as for me, I finally found the peace I had sought, not just in solitude, but in the bonds I forged with the spirits that lingered on the edge of the mountain. The curse was broken, but the story would live on, woven into the very essence of Winterbrook, a tale of darkness, redemption, and the unbreakable ties that bind us all. The curse reawakened. As the months passed, Winterbrook seemed to return to life. The weight that had hung over the town for generations was finally lifted, and for the first time, there was a sense of peace. The house that had once felt like a prison was now a sanctuary, filled with light and warmth. I had made peace with my past, with the town's dark history, and, most of all, with myself. But peace is a fragile thing, and in a place like Winterbrook, the shadows never truly disappear. It started innocently enough. A few strange occurrences here and there, an odd gust of wind on a calm day, whispers in the trees that hadn't spoken since I had freed the woman in white. At first I brushed it off as nothing more than old habits resurfacing. After all, I had lived in fear for so long that it was only natural for my mind to still search for threats that no longer existed. But soon the town began to change. The first sign. It was Agnes who first noticed something wasn't right. She came to my door one evening, her face pale and drawn, her usual calm demeanor replaced with quiet urgency. "I need to talk to you," she said, not bothering with formalities. I ushered her inside, offering her tea, but she waved it away, her hands trembling slightly. "It's happening again," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The curse. It's not gone." I froze. "What do you mean?" "We broke it. I saw it with my own eyes." Agnes shook her head, her eyes filled with fear. "I thought so too. But there are signs, things that I haven't seen in years. The birds, they're acting strange. And the trees, people say they've seen the symbols reappear." I felt a chill run down my spine. The symbols, the same ones I had discovered carved into the walls of my house, the ones that had been connected to the curse, were reappearing. "I need to see them," I said, my voice firm, despite the unease creeping in. We made our way to the forest the next morning. The sky was overcast, casting a gray pall over the town as we walked in silence. Agnes led me to the clearing where I had first confronted the spirit of the mountain, the place where I had broken the curse, or so I thought. As we approached, I could feel the air change, growing heavier with each step. The clearing looked the same at first glance, but then I saw them, the symbols freshly carved into the earth, glowing faintly in the dim light. My heart sank. "They weren't here yesterday," Agnes whispered. "Something has stirred." I knelt down, tracing the symbols with my fingers. The energy pulsing through them was unmistakable, alive, powerful, and ancient. "How could this be happening?" I murmured. "We broke the curse." Agnes was silent for a long moment before she spoke. "There's something you need to know about the curse. Something I didn't tell you before." I looked up at her, my heart pounding. "What?" "The curse wasn't just tied to the Harrow family. It's older than that, much older. The Harrows were simply the last to make the pact. The mountain, it demands something, always. A dark history revealed." Agnes led me back to her home, where she pulled out an ancient, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age and filled with strange symbols and handwritten notes. "This is the history of Winterbrook," she said, flipping through the pages. "The town was founded long before the Harrows arrived. The original settlers believed that the mountain held great power that could be harnessed if the right rituals were performed." I listened in silence as she recounted the story. The settlers had made a pact with the mountain, offering a sacrifice in exchange for protection and prosperity. For generations, the town had flourished under this pact, but it came at a terrible cost. Every few decades, a life was taken claimed by the mountain as payment for the town's continued survival. But something went wrong with the Harrows, Agnes continued. They were the last to make the pact, but they didn't fulfill their end of the bargain. The woman in white, She was supposed to be the sacrifice, but the family tried to cheat the mountain, and in doing so they cursed the entire town. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin, but we freed her. I freed her. Yes, Agnes said softly, but the pact remains. The mountain still demands its due. Over the following weeks, strange events began to plague Winterbrook once more. The townspeople, who had been so relieved by the breaking of the curse, were now gripped by fear. Crops began to fail, livestock disappeared, and people reported seeing shadowy figures in the woods at night. The whispers in the wind grew louder, more insistent, and the once vibrant town began to wither under the weight of the unseen force that was reawakening. I tried to stay rational, to believe that there was a logical explanation for everything that was happening, but deep down I knew the truth. The curse had never truly been broken. It had only been paused, and now it was back with a vengeance. The townspeople turned to Agnes for guidance, and soon the old rituals that had been abandoned long ago were being resurrected. People began leaving offerings at the base of the mountain, small tokens of food, trinkets, anything they thought might appease the spirits that haunted the land. But the mountain demanded more than trinkets. It demanded a life. At first, no one wanted to acknowledge it, but as the days passed and the strange events continued, the whispers started. The town began to fracture, fear spreading like wildfire. Some of the older residents, those who still remembered the tales of the mountain's power, began to speak openly about the need for a sacrifice. It's the only way, they would say in hushed tones. We have to give the mountain what it wants. Others, particularly the younger generation, refused to believe it. They called it superstition, old wives' tales meant to scare children. But as more and more strange things began to happen, disappearances, mysterious deaths, the divide grew. I found myself caught in the middle, torn between the logic of my modern mind and the undeniable evidence that something supernatural was at work. The prophecy. One night, as I lay in bed, trying to ignore the whispers that had once again started to fill the house, Agnes came to me in a panic. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "I found something," she said breathlessly, thrusting the ancient book into my hands, "something I missed before." I sat up, flipping through the pages as she pointed to a passage written in the same strange script as the symbols that had reappeared in the clearing. "It's a prophecy," she whispered. "It says that the curse can be broken, truly broken, but only by a sacrifice of great importance." I frowned, scanning the passage. What kind of sacrifice? Agnes hesitated before speaking. "A willing one." I felt my blood run cold. "You mean someone has to offer themselves willingly to the mountain?" "Yes," she said quietly. "It's the only way to stop the cycle. If no one offers themselves, the mountain will continue to take lives at random, growing stronger with each death." I stared at her, my mind racing. It was unthinkable. Who would do such a thing? Who would willingly give their life to break a curse that had plagued the town for centuries? As the days passed after the ritual, Winterbrook seemed to exhale a sigh of relief. The dark energy that had suffocated the town for so long lifted, and the shadows that once clung to the streets like unwelcome guests began to fade. People returned to their lives, cautiously at first, as if waiting for the next disaster to strike, but eventually the old rhythms of life returned. For the townspeople, it was over. The curse had been lifted, and they could finally live without the constant dread that had haunted them for generations. The symbols no longer appeared, and the whispers in the wind had gone silent. It was as if the mountain had finally been satisfied. But for me, the ending was far more complicated. In the quiet moments when the town was asleep and the moon hung high above the mountains, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The decision I had made, the choice to offer myself, not in death, but in blood, had been the only way to break the cycle, and yet the cost lingered. I would often wake in the middle of the night, my palm aching where I had made the cut, the memory of the clearing and its pulsing symbols vivid in my mind. The feeling that I had been chosen, that the mountain had marked me, never fully disappeared. Even now, as I walked through the town or sat in my house, I could feel its presence, watching from the distance, always waiting. There was a moment, just after the ritual, when I thought I would be consumed by the mountain's power. It was as if it wanted me, not just my blood, but my entire being. But something had pulled me back, a sense of unfinished business, or perhaps a recognition that I still had more to do in this life. The mountain had let me go, but I had no illusions about what that meant. It was a reprieve, not a release. In breaking the curse, I had bound myself to the very thing I sought to destroy. The mountain had taken what it needed, but it had left a part of itself with me, and I knew that, for the rest of my life, I was Aristomelf. The town's legacy. Winterbrook would continue, just as it always had. The old superstitions, the strange rituals, they would fade with time, buried under the weight of modernity and the convenience of forgetting. The town would move on, and in a generation or two, the curse would become nothing more than a story passed down through the years, a tale to scare children around the fire. But for me, it would never truly end. Every time I looked at the mountains, I would remember the power that lurked beneath their surface. I would remember the sacrifices made, the lives lost to the greed of those who came before, and the blood that bound me to the land. There are things we can never truly escape. The past has a way of sinking its claws into us, pulling us back when we try to move forward. I had spent so much of my life searching for answers, for meaning in the chaos, and in the end, I found that some mysteries were never meant to be solved. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And yet, there was a strange comfort in that realization. Self-reflection. In those quiet moments of reflection, I came to understand something about myself that I had never fully acknowledged before. All my life, I had been running from the past, from my fears, from the truth of who I was. Moving to Winterbrook had been my way of escaping the world, of finding a place where I could hide from the things that haunted me. But the curse, the mountain, and everything that had happened had forced me to confront the one thing I had been avoiding for so long, myself. I realized that the curse wasn't just something that afflicted the town, it was inside me as well. My doubts, my insecurities, my need to control the uncontrollable, all of it was part of the darkness that had followed me my entire life. And in breaking the curse, I had broken something within myself too. I had spent so much time trying to make sense of the world around me, trying to impose order on the chaos. But in the end, the answers didn't come from outside, they came from within. The mountain had shown me that there were forces in the world beyond my understanding, forces that couldn't be controlled or tamed, and I had to learn to live with that uncertainty. It was a hard lesson, but a necessary one. Now, as I sit in my house staring at the mountains in the distance, I feel a sense of peace that I never thought I would find. Not because I have all the answers, but because I've learned to accept that some things are beyond my control. The curse may be broken, but the echoes of it remain, a reminder of the power that still lingers in the world and in me. Perhaps in the end, that's what the mountain wanted all along. Not a sacrifice of life, but a sacrifice of certainty, a recognition that we are all bound to forces greater than ourselves, and that sometimes the only way to move forward is to let go of the need to understand everything. The mountain is still there, watching, waiting, and so am I. But for the first time in a long time, I'm no longer afraid. As we reach the end of tonight's stories on Hauntales, it's time to let your mind drift away. Listen to the sound of the rain gently falling in the background. Let each drop calm your thoughts and ease you into a peaceful sleep. There's nothing to fear now, just the soothing rhythm of the rain. Focus on your breathing, let your body relax, and allow yourself to drift deeper into rest. Sleep peacefully, and we'll meet again tomorrow night for another story. Good night.